Again, if you will. We'll move on, and we're not going to have time to get into what I call Israel's deed. I want to save that for when we have the full 30 minutes. But let's move on down to verse 5 again. Or repeating verse 5, I'm sorry. And he brought him forth, and he said, Now look at the stars, if thou be able to number them. And he said, So shall thy seed be. Now, in another instance, and I'm thinking it's back a couple chapters, when he first called Abraham, he referred to in chapter 13, flip back to it a minute, in chapter 13, verse 16. Genesis 13, verse 16. When God has just begun to deal with this man Abram, made him the Abrahamic covenant, and now he says in verse 16, And I will make thy seed, or your offspring, as the, what? The dust of the earth. Now remember, I've made an analogy ever since we started back in Genesis, that all the way since Genesis 1:1, we have the concept of God dealing with earth and heaven. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. Now, as we come in then to the role of Israel, always remember, and I'm going to put the L-Y on it, Israel is always God's earthly people, whereas we of the church age are God's heavenly people. And so we got to keep those two concepts totally separated. Israel is God's earthly people. The church is God's heavenly people. Now then, when Abraham is promised that his offspring would be as the dust of the earth, what people is he referring to? Well, the earthly. Dust is earthly. Now flip back to verse 5 of chapter 15. And now what have we got? Not the dust, but another analogy. Stars. What's that referring to? The heavenly. Now, so many people have got it all confused that when we become a Christian, we become a child of Abraham, and we become a Jew. Well, bless their hearts, they're way out in left field. Now, we become a child of Abraham by virtue of the spiritual connection that as Abraham was saved by faith plus nothing, we're saved by faith plus nothing. But never confuse the issue. When we become a child of God, we do not become, per se, a Jew.